the man known to history as Martin van Buren, was born as Martin von Buren on the 5th of December 1782 in the village of Kinderhook in the Hudson Valley in the state of New York. His father was Abraham von Buren, a modest farmer and tavern owner who later served for 10 years as town clerk of Kinderhook. In 1776, the year the Declaration of Independence was issued during the American Revolutionary War, 39-year-old Abraham married Martin's mother, 30-year-old Maria Hus von Ahlen. Maria had been married to Johann von Ahlen and had 3 children with him before his death in 1773. Following her second marriage, she would have 5 more children, of whom Martin was the third. The 8 children would occupy half of the upper floor of Abraham von Buren's tavern, which was also home to the 6 slaves the family owned. Although Maria's duties were mostly confined to the house, she had high ambitions for all of her children. By the time Martin was born, her elder children were well on their way to becoming lawyers. The family name came from the town of Buren in the southern Netherlands, from which the von Buren's ancestors moved to the Dutch colony of New Netherland in North America in the 17th century. After England seized control of the colony in 1664, it was renamed the Province of New York in honor of James, Duke of York, who would later become King James II of England. Although New York became part one of the emerging 13 colonies of England in North America, there continued to be a large Dutch community in the province, and the von Burens were notable landowners. Van Buren had pure Dutch ancestry, and accordingly he was brought up speaking Dutch, making him the only president of the United States to date not to have had English as his first language. When Martin van Buren was born, the United States was emerging as a new nation as the American Revolutionary War came to an end after years of war with the British, following disagreements about the British Parliament's right to impose taxes without adequate political representation. Eventually, after a long struggle, George Washington's Continental Army forced the surrender of the English at Yorktown in 1781, causing the British government to end offensive operations in North America and begin peace talks. Through the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the independence of the United States was recognized by the British. Within a few years, the new republic adopted a constitution to strengthen the powers of the central federal government, placing executive powers in the hands of a president. General Washington was elected the first president of the United States, while the country's politics was dominated by the founding fathers well into the 19th century. Over the next several decades, numerous political parties would come and go in America, and its politics was not monolithically dominated by just 2 parties in the way that it is today. Between the birth of the nation and the mid-1820s, an arrangement known as the First Party System prevailed, one in which the major division in American political life was between the Federalists, who favored a strong central government in Washington, D.C., and the Democratic Republican Party that was more inclined to promote the independence of individual states. Van Buren's political career would reflect this political fluidity, and he would live through the first, second, and third party systems in the U.S. As a young boy, Martin helped out at his father's farm and tavern, where he was regarded as intelligent and respectful. He attended his local one-room school in Kinderhook until the age of 14, where he learned English and a small amount of Latin. In 1796, he followed the example of his half-brothers by becoming a law clerk at the practice run by Francis Sylvester and his father Peter, who, at that time, was also serving as a Federalist member of the New York State Senate. Despite the Sylvesters' efforts to convert their young clerk to the Federalist cause, Van Buren remained attached to the Democratic Republicans. In 1801, Van Buren attended the Democratic Republican District Convention in Troy and helped secure the nomination of John Peter Van Ness for Congress. When the Republicans won a landslide in New York in the general election, Van Ness was duly elected to Congress. Although Van Buren continued to have a cordial relationship with the Sylvesters, in 1802 he accepted John Van Ness's offer to go to New York City and finished his legal training as a clerk under Van Ness's younger brother William. William Van Ness was a friend and supporter of Aaron Burr, the New York Democratic-Republican politician serving as Jefferson's vice president, meaning that Van Buren was already moving by the time he reached his 20th birthday in high political circles. When Van Buren arrived in New York, he witnessed a struggle for control of the Democratic-Republican Party between Burr and DeWitt Clinton, nephew of seven-time Governor George Clinton. Van Buren recognized that Clinton was gaining the upper hand and was keen to rid himself of his association with Burr via the Van Nesses. In November 1803, he was admitted to the state bar as an attorney and returned to Kinderhook to join the legal practice run by his half-brother James von Ahlen. The partnership had many clients, and Van Buren made his name as a specialist in dealing with land claims, often serving as attorney for renters who challenged their landlords. In February 1807, he married his distant cousin Hannah Hoos. The couple would have 5 sons, 4 of whom would survive into adulthood. Soon after returning to Kinderhook, Van Buren broke with the Van Nesses by voting for the Clintonite candidate Morgan Lewis instead of Burr in the 1804 election for New York governor. Van Buren's legal practice had also caught the attention of DeWitt Clinton, who began to send lucrative cases his way. Governor Lewis had broken with Clinton during his term, and at the following election in 1807, Clinton supported the candidacy of Daniel D. Tompkins. Van Buren supported and campaigned for Tompkins, who was duly elected and inaugurated as governor on the 1st of July. In 1808, Tompkins appointed Van Buren to the office of Surrogate of Columbia County, New York, succeeding his half-brother and legal partner James Van Allen, a position which involved management of property and estates in the region. In 1808, Van Buren moved to the city of Hudson, the new capital of Columbia County, some 15 miles from Kinderhook. For the next 4 years, he focused his energies on expanding his legal practice while also working to promote Clinton's interests in Columbia County. In 1812, he gained the Democratic-Republican nomination for a seat in the state Senate with Clinton's backing, but his opponent, Edward Livingston, was supported not only by the Federalists but by 3 opposing Democratic-Republican factions. Despite these odds, Van Buren was elected by a narrow majority of 200 votes, thus becoming one of the most prominent Democratic-Republican leaders in the state alongside Clinton and Governor Tompkins. In the presidential election of 1812, the Democratic-Republican incumbent James Madison of Virginia sought a second term in office. Although the National Party organization backed Madison, DeWitt Clinton challenged the Virginian on the basis that since 3 of the 4 American presidents to date had been from the southern state of Virginia, it was time for a northerner to become president. Although Van Buren had reservations about Clinton, he supported his candidacy and helped to deliver him New York's 29 electoral votes. But after finding out that Clinton had made serious efforts to seek an alliance with the Federalist Party, Van Buren broke with his political ally. Regardless of Federalist backing for Clinton, Madison managed to win re-election. Despite their previous alliance, Van Buren and Clinton had significant ideological differences. While Clinton favored New York's development as the main center of commerce and trade in the nascent United States, and in 1817 secured approval from the legislature for the construction of the Erie Canal connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, Van Buren remained faithful to the Jeffersonian vision of a nation based around small landholders. After moving to the state capital of Albany in 1816, Van Buren became leader of a faction known as the Bucktails, which pledged loyalty to the democratic-republican principles rather than the political ambitions of particular individuals. Prominent members of the group included Benjamin Butler, who joined Van Buren's legal partnership in 1817, and Silas Wright, who would become Van Buren's closest confidant for the next 30 years. From the mid-1810s, the Federalist Party entered a period of terminal decline. In 1816, James Monroe, a Democratic Republican, won the U.S. presidential election, the 4th Virginian to hold the office. Van Buren opposed Monroe's desire to work with the Federalists in the name of national unity, which he regarded as a recipe for further factionalism within the Democratic-Republican Party. He set out to build a network of party institutions from the towns and villages up to county, district, and state level, which were committed to a common set of traditional Democratic-Republican principles. State party leaders ensured discipline by publishing the party's decisions and positions in the Albany Argus, distributed throughout the state. This professionalized system of party organization was labeled by Van Buren's opponents as the Albany Regency. By 1820, Van Buren had also taken over the Tammany Hall machine and become the undisputed leader of the Democratic-Republican Party in the state of New York. At 38 years of age, he was running a lucrative legal practice and had delicately maneuvered his way around the powerful individuals and factions in New York state politics to build his own political networks and take control of the state's politics. Van Buren's political rise was accompanied by a series of family tragedies. In 1814, his wife, Hannah, gave birth to his 4th son, whom he named after General Winfield Scott, a hero of the War of 1812 against the British, who had worked with Van Buren in defending New York from the British. However, Winfield Scott Van Buren died a few weeks after his birth. Van Buren's father, Abraham, passed away in 1817, his mother, Maria, the following year, and in 1819, Van Buren's wife, Hannah, died of tuberculosis just before her 36th birthday. He never remarried, and instead became a devoted father to his 4 surviving sons, Abraham, John, Martin, and Smith, all of whom would go on to support their father's political career at state and national level. The founders of the American Republic had attempted to limit the political influence of the popular masses, which they feared would create the conditions for mob rule. In 1821, a constitutional convention was called to revise the 1777 New York State Constitution, which was considered too undemocratic for the times. Van Buren was a key influence in the framing of the new document, which extended voting rights among the white population while maintaining a property qualification, but voting restrictions for the black population increased, and there were no provisions for female suffrage. The Council of Appointment and Council of Revision were abolished, making the state government more responsive to voters. That same year, Van Buren won election to the United States Senate for the state of New York. It was the climax of his rise to become a politician of national importance. In early November 1821, Van Buren moved from Albany to Washington, D.C., in advance of the new Senate session in December. He was soon named to the Senate Finance Committee and chaired the Judiciary Committee, where he established new district courts in the western states. The main issues which dominated American political debate at the time were tariffs and public infrastructure improvements. Northerners tended to support higher tariffs in order to protect domestic industry, but the less industrial South preferred to keep them low to benefit from cheaper imports. Van Buren tended to favor lower tariffs, but recognized that some Jeffersonians in the South wanted higher tariffs for certain agricultural products. President Monroe championed a program of national infrastructure improvements funded by the federal government, but did not believe he had the constitutional right to do so and sought a constitutional amendment from Congress. Van Buren regularly opposed bills to finance national improvements at the expense of the Treasury and remained committed to Jefferson's views on the rights of individual states. Between 1819 and 1821, disagreements between North and South about the westward expansion of slavery threatened to undermine the Union. Most of the northern states, with their more industrialized economies, had banned slavery, while the agricultural southern states relied on slavery for the labor-intensive work of planting and picking cotton and tobacco. President Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase from France in 1803 doubled the size of the United States and led to westward migration towards and then beyond the Mississippi River. When Congress considered Missouri's application for statehood, it was divided between the Northerners, who wanted to restrict slavery in the new state, and the Southerners, who wanted Missouri to be admitted without any restrictions. The issue was temporarily resolved by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which admitted Missouri to the Union as a slave-owning state, recognized Maine as a free state, and banned slavery north of parallel 36 degrees 30 minutes north in the Louisiana Territory. Nevertheless, the southern slaveholding states remained concerned that the Northerners might gain control of federal institutions and abolish slavery nationwide. In the early 1820s, Secretary of War John Calhoun of South Carolina had moved away from his earlier nationalism to become a champion of states' rights in the South, but resisted Van Buren's efforts to create a national alliance on these principles. In 1824, the U.S. presidential election failed to go the way Van Buren wished. Monroe's decision not to seek a third term in office at a time when there was no constitutional impediment to doing so created a free-for-all among the Democratic-Republican candidates vying to succeed him. The major candidates for the election were Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, and General Andrew Jackson, the popular war hero who had defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815 at the end of the War of 1812. Van Buren believed Adams and Clay had Federalist tendencies and mistrusted Jackson because he was not a professional politician. Accordingly, he backed Crawford. But Crawford suffered a stroke during the election which undermined his electability. He eventually finished a distant third to Adams and Jackson, though, as no candidate won a majority of the electoral votes, the House of Representatives had to choose among the top 3 candidates. Although Jackson had won substantially more votes than the others, Henry Clay helped to deliver 3 crucial states to Adams in the House election, ensuring Adams' election as the 6th U.S. president in what many quickly termed a corrupt bargain. During the Adams presidency, Van Buren led the congressional opposition to his centralizing policies. The president was also opposed by Calhoun's Southern States Rights faction and General Jackson's supporters, who believed he had been cheated of the presidency by corrupt Washington elites. In addition to marshalling the anti-Adams bloc to vote against the president's initiatives in Congress, Van Buren had his eye on the 1828 presidential election and was looking for a candidate to support who was favorable to the cause of strong states' rights. In 1826, he set aside his earlier reservations about Jackson and sought to build a coalition that would take the general to the White House after the next election. Van Buren amplified criticisms which argued that Jackson had been denied the White House in 1824 through a circling of the wagons amongst establishment politicians and championed the general as the people's candidate. In 1827, he went on a tour of the South to rally support for Jackson. During this, he was non-committal on the issue of slavery, keeping his own views to himself to avoid alienating either side. In 1828, in order to get Jackson elected, Van Buren began building a new coalition of political interest groups in both his own northern base in New York and in the anti-Adams southern states. It would be called the Democratic Party, a successor to the Republican Democratic Party, which was declining. Hence, Martin Van Buren, along with Andrew Jackson, was the founder of one of the 2 political parties which have dominated American politics since the mid-19th century. It would face numerous other parties before the advent of the Republican Party in the mid-1850s, notably the National Republican Party in the late 1820s and 1830s. However, Jackson and Van Buren, as his main supporter, became so ubiquitous in American politics in the late 1820s and 1830s that historians often define this second party system that succeeded the Federalist and Republican Democratic First Party system as being a clash between Jacksonites and anti-Jacksonites. In order to further bolster Jackson's chances, Van Buren also decided to stand for election in the early winter of 1828 to become governor of New York, an election he would win comfortably. A few weeks later, Jackson defeated John Quincy Adams in the presidential election. Van Buren's coalition had succeeded. Jackson rewarded him by making him the new Secretary of State in his first administration, causing Van Buren to resign as governor of New York after just 2 months in that office. By the time Van Buren arrived in Washington, President Jackson had already nominated ambassadors to England and France without the Secretary of State's advice. Despite this less than ideal start, the 2 men soon became effective collaborators. Although Jackson had the reputation of being a belligerent nationalist while in uniform. As president, he preferred a more diplomatic approach in order to advance America's foreign policy interests. Adopting this flexible approach, in October 1830, Van Buren managed to make an agreement with Great Britain which allowed American merchant ships to trade with the British colonies in the West Indies after years of being locked out of that market. He was less successful in negotiations over a long-standing boundary dispute between the state of Maine and British Canada, or in obtaining British recognition of American claims to the Oregon Territory on the Pacific coast. His efforts to negotiate the purchase of Texas from Mexico also went nowhere. While Van Buren did not leave a lasting legacy as Secretary of State, he proved an effective and industrious diplomat despite his lack of experience in international affairs. In addition to his duties in the State Department, Van Buren was involved in political intrigue as well. After his election, Jackson had removed many federal appointees whom he suspected of having Federalist sympathies and replaced them with his own supporters. Jackson and Van Buren were criticized for creating a spoils system which placed partisanship above ability, but Jackson argued that the rotation of office holders was crucial to the functioning of a democratic system, while the practice of state officials remaining in their posts for life, which prevailed at that time, created corruption and inertia. Van Buren also had to deal with intrigue from Vice President Calhoun, who, in late 1828, had authored an anonymous pamphlet criticizing some Jacksonian policies. Calhoun's standing with the president was further undermined by the so-called Petticoat Affair, which split Jackson's cabinet from the earliest days of the administration. Jackson's Secretary of War, John Eaton, had married the young widow Peggy O'Neill shortly before coming to office. Amidst rumours that the Eatons were having an affair before their marriage, the wives of Jackson's cabinet secretaries, led by Floride Calhoun, refused to attend social events where the Eatons were present, alienating them from much of Washington society. Both Jackson and Van Buren supported the Eatons. The Petticoat Affair strengthened the president's ties with his Secretary of State, while further weakening those with Vice President Calhoun. Early in 1831, Van Buren was frustrated by the political infighting within the Jackson administration and offered his resignation. This was quite probably a ploy designed to force Jackson into purging his administration of Calhoun's supporters, and the president duly obliged Van Buren, reshuffling his cabinet. As part of this, Van Buren himself was appointed as ambassador to Great Britain, but his tenure in England would prove short-lived, as Calhoun's supporters refused to confirm Van Buren's appointment in the Senate, even as Martin was taking up residence in London in the autumn of 1831. In the end, the Senate vote was tied, and Calhoun, as vice president, albeit one who was now entirely antagonistic to the president himself, refused to confirm Van Buren. It was the beginning of a series of direct showdowns between Jackson and Van Buren on the one side and Calhoun and his supporters within the Democratic Party on the other over issues such as the rights of the southern states and the position of the Bank of America. All of this worked very much to Van Buren's advantage. Having had his term as ambassador to Britain cut short, he spent a few months travelling Europe, visiting the von Buren's family's ancestral homeland in the Netherlands. When he returned to the US, things were so bad between Jackson and Calhoun that the president decided to remove him from the ticket in the 1832 presidential election. Instead, Van Buren would now be his running partner, and it was a successful one. After the election at the end of the year, Jackson defeated the National Republican candidate Henry Clay comfortably. On the 4th of March 1833, Martin Van Buren was sworn in as U.S. Vice President. The officer's formal duties under the Constitution were relatively light and mainly consisted of presiding over the Senate. Though several former vice presidents, such as Jefferson, Burr, and Calhoun, had been politically active, none had managed to carve out a position as a strong ally of the actual president. Although no vice president had succeeded to the presidency since Jefferson in 1801, Van Buren was widely expected to be Jackson's successor in the White House. In 1833, the disparate political groups opposed to Jackson coalesced to form the Whig Party, taking their name from the English Whigs who opposed royal autocracy, a pointed statement about the perceived heavy-handedness of Jackson's presidential style. In the Senate, the anti-Jacksonians had a narrow majority of 23 to 21, ensuring that Van Buren would have a difficult time presiding over the upper chamber. With this in mind, he counseled the president to compromise on matters relating to tariffs and banking. Though Jackson accepted the tariff compromise, in mid-July he authorized the withdrawal of federal deposits from the National Bank and their transfer into state banks. This led to targeted efforts by financiers to restrict the flow of credit into the American economy, and a downturn ensued, leading to further compromises in the painful early financial history of the United States. By the mid-1830s, Van Buren was entering his mid-50s. He had spent a decade and a half on the national political stage, plying the political organization skills he had developed in New York to the federal level. After setting aside his initial reservations, he entered a political alliance with Andrew Jackson and soon became his closest political ally, orchestrating the formation of the Democratic Party in order to get Jackson elected in 1828 and then becoming his vice president in 1833. Now, with Jackson's second term coming to an end, Van Buren easily won the nomination for president at the Democratic National Convention in May 1835. While Van Buren committed to continuing Jackson's policies, the Whigs were not yet a coherent party and chose 3 candidates, hoping that collectively they could split the vote and force a contingent election in the House of Representatives. These were General William Henry Harrison, a veteran of the War of 1812, Jackson's former friend Hugh Lawson White of Tennessee in the South, and Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts in New England. Their policy backfired spectacularly. In the election, Van Buren won just over 50% of the popular vote and a total of 170 electoral votes, demolishing the 3 Whig candidates who won just 113 electoral votes between them. In the Senate, the Democrats won a healthy majority, but the Democratic majority in the House was far narrower. On the 4th of March 1837, Martin Van Buren was sworn in as the 8th President of the United States. In accordance with his belief in limited government, Van Buren did not believe he had much to do as president, since Jackson had already fought and won many major political battles of the time to Van Buren's mind. He retained most of Jackson's cabinet, including John Forsyth as Secretary of State, Levi Woodbury of New Hampshire as Treasury Secretary, and his former law partner Benjamin Butler as Attorney General. Unlike his predecessor, Van Buren relied heavily on advice from his cabinet secretaries before coming to a final decision. He also welcomed the advice from Jackson, who wrote a couple of times a month primarily about issues that hung over from his administration. Van Buren's vice president was Richard Johnson from Kentucky. He had proved to be such a disastrous campaigner in the election that he was, basically, an outcast from the very beginning of the administration's time in office and would play no role in it. Pursuant from this, Van Buren has the curious distinction that when he ran for re-election in 1840, he did so without any vice-presidential running mate. Van Buren had inherited a strong economy from Jackson as a result of increased cotton exports to England, the country's expansion to the west, and the availability of credit to finance speculation in these lands. However, there were issues. The state banks that Jackson had championed were issuing volumes of paper money which were beyond the economy's capacity to absorb the extra credit, causing an inflationary bubble. In an effort to put the brakes on such speculation, during the final months of his presidency, Jackson issued the Specie Circular, which forced buyers to pay for federal land using precious metals. The shortage of gold and silver in the country caused credit to dry up as commercial banks suspended payments in specie in order to remain solvent, while many smaller banking institutions were forced to close their doors. The banking crisis led in turn to a general economic slowdown as public and private investment fell alongside sales of manufactured and agricultural goods. The Panic of 1837 was the United States' deepest economic depression up to that time, and would last for the next 5 years, casting a large shadow over Van Buren's presidency, which he struggled to overcome. In September 1837, Van Buren called a special session of Congress to discuss how to address the country's economic problems. He denied charges from political opponents and the financial community that the economic damage was the result of Jackson's policies, and instead blamed the financiers for excessive speculation during the boom. Remaining faithful to his belief in Jeffersonian limited government, Van Buren refused to entertain calls for the federal government to intervene forcefully and preferred to leave it to the markets to stabilize themselves, stating in his annual message to Congress in 1840 that all communities are apt to look to government for too much. Van Buren therefore refused to provide any federal government support to those impoverished by the economic crisis, and relief efforts were limited to charities and local governments. In fact, the president made further cuts to government spending, motivated by his belief that the private sector would step in to provide the necessary investment in the economy to return to growth. Instead, it exacerbated the economic contraction and increased unemployment. Van Buren did eventually introduce some limited measures in response to the economic downturn, such as the issuance of $10 million in Treasury notes to increase money in circulation. In order to increase employment opportunities for the unemployed, the president instituted a 10-hour working day for federal employees working on construction projects. Van Buren also recognized that Jackson's policy of using state banks to hold federal deposits was unsound, and proposed establishing an independent treasury to hold federal government funds in gold and silver, while placing limits on the government's ability to issue paper money at will. Despite Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, it took 3 years before Van Buren's proposal was enacted into law. It was only after a second downturn, which began in late 1839, that Van Buren reminded Congress that the problem of federal deposits still required a solution, that Congress finally passed the Independent Treasury Bill, allowing Van Buren to sign it into law on the 4th of July, 1840. In addition to the fallout from the Bank War, Van Buren inherited Jackson's policy of Native American removal. In response to disputes between southern states and the Native American nations over land in places like Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama, in 1830, President Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the federal government authority to remove Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in these regions to new lands west of the Mississippi River in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. Like most of the Democratic Party, Van Buren supported the policy as the only means of preventing bloodshed between whites and Native Americans in the South. While most of the removals were carried out under the Jackson administration, it was up to Van Buren to oversee the removal of the Cherokees. By 1838, 2,000 Cherokees had gone west voluntarily, and in May, Van Buren ordered General Winfield Scott and an army of 7,000 men to carry out the relocation of 14,000 Cherokees. The removal took place during a particularly harsh winter, and more than 4,000 Cherokees perished during the Trail of Tears. Although he had delegated the execution of the removal policy to the War Department, Van Buren nevertheless bears responsibility for continuing Jackson's policies in what is considered an unequivocal act of ethnic cleansing and quasi-genocide by the U.S. government. Further to the west, Van Buren had to deal with the growing problem of Texas. After declaring independence from Mexico in 1836, the Republic of Texas sought annexation by the United States. Although Jackson had been in favor, he recognized not only that this would provoke war with Mexico, but also that the status of slavery in Texas would be a politically contentious issue between North and South. For similar reasons, Van Buren refused to contemplate the annexation of Texas during his presidency, though he took steps to address diplomatic tensions with Mexico. At the other end of the nation, tensions flared up on the British-Canadian border twice during Van Buren's presidency. In late 1837, a rebellion broke out in Ontario and Quebec against British rule, which was supported by Americans across the border in upstate New York. At the same time, hostilities broke out between American settlers and British troops due to the dispute over the Maine-Canada border. Van Buren desperately hoped to avoid war with Great Britain and ordered federal troops under the dependable General Winfield Scott to calm the situation in both New York and Maine. In the latter case, the border dispute went to arbitration and was finally resolved in an 1842 treaty. In spite of Van Buren's inclination to avoid the subject of slavery due to its tendency to divide both the nation and the Democratic Party, former President John Quincy Adams had returned to the House of Representatives and remained vocal on the issue throughout the 1830s, in spite of a series of gag rules passed by the House to prevent discussion of slavery or its abolition in the chamber. In 1839, a Spanish ship by the name of Amistad, which had sailed from Africa with a cargo of slaves, experienced an uprising as it sailed from Cuba to the southern United States. The rebel slaves seized control of the ship and sailed it to the port of New London, in the free northern state of Connecticut. Van Buren was ever fearful that the issue would split the nation and believed the Africans on board should be returned to the Spanish authorities in Cuba. The Federal District Court instead ruled in favor of the Africans and their right to return to Africa, prompting Van Buren to appeal to the Supreme Court. With John Quincy Adams arguing the case on behalf of the Africans, and Van Buren's Attorney General, Henry Gilpin, presenting the government's case, in March 1841, the court ruled against the government, asserting that the Africans were free to return to Africa. Van Buren and the Democrats believed that he had performed reasonably well as president and had honored Jackson's legacy effectively. As he prepared to run for re-election, the two-party system continued to mature. Having opposed Jackson for his excesses, Calhoun and his Southern States Rights Coalition drifted back towards the Democrats, and, in a surprise show of unity, the former vice president announced his support for Van Buren in 1839, considerably strengthening the president's southern flank. At the same time, Democrats who opposed Van Buren's fiscal policies sided with the Whigs. Unlike in 1836, the Whig Party organization had evolved and would prove a more difficult rival than the 1840 election, with General William Henry Harrison running against Van Buren alongside John Tyler. Harrison was a hero of the War of 1812, having defeated the Confederacy, led by charismatic Native American Chief Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 and the Battle of the Thames in 1813. In the 1836 presidential election, he had been the most successful of the three Whig candidates by winning 73 electoral votes and 7 states. In addition to their previous characterization of Van Buren as a corrupt and unprincipled establishment politician, the Whigs portrayed him as out of touch with the common people as a result of his failure to effectively deal with the economic depression, nicknaming the president Martin Van Ruin. As was expected of an incumbent president at the time, Van Buren focused on matters of state and did little campaigning himself, but allowed prominent Democrats to seek votes on his behalf in their respective states. The Democrats expanded their existing networks in the party and the press to mobilize the people. Unlike the Whigs, who ran a highly personalized campaign and did not have a national party platform, the Democrats ran a campaign focused on the issues that differentiated the two sides. They remained faithful to the Jacksonian program of limited federal government spending, lower tariffs, and opposition to a national bank. Accordingly, the Democrats argued that Harrison would bring back the old Federalist policies which they claimed were not only unsuccessful, but posed a threat to American democracy. In a sign of the effectiveness of both parties' mobilization campaigns, almost 2.5 million people, over 80% of the electorate, turned out to vote in the 1840 presidential election. While the popular vote was close, with Harrison on 53% and Van Buren on 47%, in the Electoral College the Whig candidate won a landslide by winning 234 electoral votes to the incumbent's 60. Van Buren had failed to pull a rabbit out of the hat and was forced to hand over the reins of office to President Harrison on the 4th of March, 1841. After leaving the capital, the 58-year-old Van Buren returned to New York and was back at his hometown of Kinderhook by May. As president, he had continued to pursue the Jacksonian-Jeffersonian policies of limited government that he had supported for the entirety of his political career, and believed that he had done a good job as president. However, his reluctance to intervene to resolve the economic depression prompted the American people to boot him out of office, and Van Buren believed that his political career was over. In 1839, he had bought an estate of 50 acres from the Van Ness family, along with 150 acres of neighboring farmland, which he renamed Lindenwold. Although he started supervising the operations of his farm and living the life of a retired country gentleman, it wasn't long before he returned to the political stage. With an eye on the 1844 election, in early 1842, he embarked on a 5-month tour of the South and West, during which he met both Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay. Political developments in Washington seemed to favor the Democrats in the next election. On the 4th of April 1841, exactly a month after his inauguration, the 67-year-old President Harrison died unexpectedly and was succeeded by Vice President Tyler. The new president, nicknamed by his detractors as His Accidency, remained sympathetic towards states' rights and vetoed several measures passed by congressional Whigs, including the creation of a new national bank. In September 1841, Henry Clay moved to expel the president from the Whig Party, leaving Tyler politically homeless. With no prospect of running for re-election on a Whig ticket, Tyler unsuccessfully attempted to court the Democrats. Meanwhile, Calhoun had begun to make his voice heard again. With neither man able to gain much traction with the Democrats, in April 1844, Calhoun unexpectedly joined the Tyler administration as Secretary of State. Together, they championed the annexation of Texas, the issue that Van Buren had left to rest due to the sectional tensions over slavery. Calhoun purposely sought to fuel the sectional tensions in an attempt to unite Southern Democrats and Whigs by arguing that the annexation of Texas was a matter of necessity in order to prevent the abolition of slavery. Many Democrats denounced the Tyler-Calhoun alliance as political opportunism and argued that the party should retake the initiative on annexation. In a letter to Mississippi Congressman William Hammett, the cautious Van Buren reiterated his view that annexation of Texas would provoke war with Mexico and should be avoided. Van Buren's views on Texas alienated him from a significant minority of Southern Democrats who would play a crucial role in the Democratic National Convention in Baltimore at the end of May 1844. The Hammett letter had prompted Andrew Jackson to publicize a letter in favor of immediate annexation. At the Democratic Convention, Van Buren expected to win a majority of the delegates, but not enough to overcome the 2/3 threshold that was required. When the first ballot was cast at the convention, Van Buren received 146 out of 266 votes, more than 30 votes short of the 2/3 threshold. In subsequent ballots, Van Buren's support ebbed away, while his main rival, Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan, picked up support. In order to prevent Cass's nomination, Van Buren's supporters, Benjamin Butler and Silas Wright, looked for an alternative candidate. In the midst of this political maneuvering, former Speaker of the House, James K. Polk of Tennessee, who had initially been favored for the vice presidential nomination, emerged as the compromise candidate. Polk shared much of Van Buren's small state ideology, but was a vocal advocate of the annexation of Texas and duly won the nomination on the 9th ballot after Butler withdrew Van Buren from consideration. Grateful for the support of the Van Burenites, Polk offered Wright the vice-presidential nomination, but the latter declined out of loyalty to the former president. Polk ran a campaign favoring the annexation of Texas and the recognition of American claims to Oregon up to the parallel 54 degrees 40 minutes north, adopting the campaign slogan 54-40 or fight, in reference to the Oregon issue. Although bitterly disappointed by his failure to win the Democratic nomination and having reservations about Polk's calls for territorial expansion in both Texas and Oregon, Van Buren mobilized his machine behind the Democratic nominee in the presidential election. The Van Burenites informed Polk that Silas Wright's run for the New York governorship would be crucial in turning out New York voters for the presidential election. While Polk defeated Clay in the presidential election by 170 electoral votes to 105, he carried New York's 36 electoral votes by a 1% margin. As Wright won the governorship by a margin of more than 2%, the Van Burenites believed that without Wright, Polk would have lost New York and the presidency. Van Buren and his allies therefore expected that he would have considerable influence on the composition of the new president's cabinet. Despite Polk's promises to reward the Van Burenites with senior cabinet appointments, the only New Yorker the president appointed to his cabinet was Secretary of War William Marcy, formerly a close colleague of Van Buren's, but now the leader of the New York Democrats, who opposed him. Polk attempted to make amends by offering Van Buren the ambassadorship to Great Britain, but it was too little, too late, and Van Buren declined. As he had anticipated, the admission of Texas to the Union in December 1845 led to the outbreak of war with Mexico early in 1846, although the resulting Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 went incredibly well for the U.S. and ended in the annexation of a vast swathe of land running from Texas westwards through New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada to California and the Pacific Ocean. Polk also expanded in the Northwest by securing British recognition of American sovereignty over the Oregon Territory up to the 49th parallel in a compromise, in spite of his belligerent campaign rhetoric. Domestically, Polk resurrected Van Buren's independent treasury after it had been abolished by the Whigs in 1841 and passed a lower tariff in 1846. Although Polk had gone a long way in continuing the Jacksonian legacy, Van Buren felt betrayed by the president and the Southern Democrats. In August 1846, Van Buren joined Northern Democrats and some Whigs in supporting the Wilmot Proviso, a measure proposing to ban slavery in any territory the United States was to acquire from Mexico in the ongoing war. Van Buren supported the measure not so much for its anti-slavery position, but as a means to challenge the influence of the Southern Democrats in the Polk administration. Van Buren had considered himself retired from active politics, leaving his son John and his friend Benjamin Butler to fight his political battles on his behalf. In order to regain their influence in the National Party, the Van Burenites first had to regain the initiative in the New York Democratic Party. Van Buren's group were nicknamed the Barn Burners, while their opponents within the party, who departed from Jacksonian orthodoxy by supporting banks and public infrastructure, were known as Hunkers. At the state party convention in September 1847, the barn burners endorsed an anti-slavery resolution similar in substance to the Wilmot Proviso. When the Hunkers refused barn burner demands, the latter walked out of the convention, leaving the party fatally split and allowing the Whigs to make significant gains in the November 1847 state elections. In response, Van Buren wrote a lengthy document, later known as the Barn Burner Manifesto, which was published in April 1848 after revisions from John Van Buren and State Assemblyman Samuel J. Tilden. Van Buren asserted the barn burners' claim to be the legitimate Democratic Party of New York and argued that Congress had the right to restrict slavery in the territories. In addition to the constitutional arguments he presented, Van Buren argued that it was necessary to exclude slave labor as white free laborers would be outcompeted. The barn burners took their manifesto to the Democratic National Convention in May, but their demands to be recognized as the sole legitimate representatives of the Democratic Party in New York were not met, and the National Party nominated Lewis Cass as its presidential candidate. Though Van Buren was not ready to abandon the party he had created, he was pushed into doing so by his supporters. After the barn burners held their own convention in June and nominated Van Buren as their candidate in the 1848 U.S. presidential election, in August the newly formed Free Soil Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery, also nominated Van Buren despite his previous belief that slavery was a states' rights issue. Van Buren was also uncomfortable with sharing a platform with many of his former political enemies, while his running mate was Charles Francis Adams, the son of his one-time rival John Quincy Adams. Despite these mutual reservations, the Free Soilers ran an energetic campaign across the northern states. Although Van Buren did not win a single electoral college vote, he received 10% of the popular vote and outpolled Cass in New York, ensuring victory for the Whig candidate General Zachary Taylor. Van Buren's role in denying Cass the presidency strengthened the barn burners' case that the Southern Democrats could not do without them. Having made their point, the Van Burenites returned to the Democratic fold. The question over the status of slavery in the territories conquered from Mexico was resolved in a series of compromises brokered by the veteran Henry Clay. Although opposed by many Southern pro-slavery Democrats and Northern anti-slavery Whigs, as well as President Taylor, after the president's death in office in July 1850, his successor, Millard Fillmore, supported the Compromise of 1850 to dampen the sectional tensions. Van Buren now hoped that sectional and regional issues would remain in the background of U.S. politics. After making peace with the Hunkers in New York, the barn burners were happy to support the candidacy of Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire in the 1852 presidential election, and the restored Democratic unity enabled Pierce to win a landslide over his Whig opponent, Van Buren's old friend, General Winfield Scott. After 1852, Van Buren settled into life as a retired elder statesman, no longer actively involved in politics, but retaining an interest in political developments. The brief respite offered by the Compromise of 1850 did not last long, and tensions over slavery erupted once again when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was introduced, providing admission of both states to the Union while leaving it up to their state conventions to determine the status of slavery. Thereafter, the issue of slavery became particularly contentious in Kansas, causing a fresh split in the Democratic Party between North and South. With the Whig Party disintegrating, anti-slavery Whigs, the Free Soilers, and some barn burners joined the new Republican Party, formed in 1854, which committed to ending the further expansion of slavery in the United States. Given his Free Soil candidacy in 1848, Van Buren was invited to the 1856 Republican National Convention, but declined. Despite his private misgivings about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Van Buren supported the measure in public out of loyalty to the Democrats. The emergence of the Republican Party in 1854 ushered in the third party system, one which closely resembles the modern party system in the United States in that it increasingly became a two-party system between the Democrats and the Republicans, though the Democrats remained hugely divided for many years to come on the slavery issue, and the political map of blue and red states in America was the direct inverse in the second half of the 19th century from what it is today. In 1853, Van Buren made a long trip to Europe, prompted by his son Martin Jr.'s failing health. While his son received treatment in London, the elder Van Buren went to Ireland, France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Italy. During an extended stay in Naples, he resumed work on the autobiography he was writing, which was interrupted by Martin Jr.'s death in Paris in March 1855. After returning to the United States, Van Buren continued to work on the autobiography with the assistance of his surviving sons. The autobiography would remain unfinished, and in 1867 his surviving sons published the section on political parties as a separate volume under the title Inquiry into the Origins and Course of Political Parties in the United States, which described the popular political debates of the Revolutionary years and the struggle between the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. The incomplete autobiography covering Van Buren's life up to the 1830s was published in 2 volumes in 1920 after the manuscript had been donated to the Library of Congress. In the 1860 presidential election, the Democrats were split between a northern faction led by Stephen Douglas and a southern faction led by Vice President John Breckinridge. This allowed Republican Abraham Lincoln to be elected to the presidency, prompting South Carolina and a host of southern states to secede from the Union to form the Confederate States of America, fearing that Lincoln would abolish slavery entirely. In April 1861, soon after the Confederacy fired on the Union garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, Franklin Pierce wrote to Van Buren as the most senior of the 5 living ex-presidents to convene a meeting with Tyler, Buchanan, and Fillmore to consider measures to prevent disunion. Van Buren replied that he was too old and would leave the younger men in the group to take the initiative. But nothing came of it, as the events of the bloody American Civil War made further compromise impossible. In the final year of his life, Van Buren supported Lincoln and the Unionist cause and believed that secession was unconstitutional. Despite some abortive attempts to continue working on his autobiography, his health was in decline, and on the 24th of July, 1862, Martin Van Buren died at the age of 79 at home in Lindenwold. Though Van Buren died during a period of disunion, the Democratic Party, which he founded nearly 200 years ago, continues to be one of the 2 main parties in the United States. Martin Van Buren leaves behind a legacy as the father of the American Democratic Party. After developing his skills as a political organizer in New York, Van Buren applied his methods to the national level and helped build the coalition that led Andrew Jackson to the White House through the 1828 election. In spite of occasional splits, the Democratic Party that Van Buren built around a shared commitment to Jacksonian and Jeffersonian notions of limited government and states' rights held the presidency for 24 of the 32 years between Jackson's inauguration in 1829 and Lincoln's in 1861, and dominated the second-party system. After outmaneuvering Calhoun to become Jackson's successor as president in 1837, Van Buren believed he had conducted himself as president reasonably successfully, but his record was marred by his unwillingness to take decisive action during the economic depression that affected the nation throughout his term, costing him re-election in 1840, while his continuance of the Native American removal policy along the Trail of Tears is a major stain on his legacy. Despite his election defeat, Van Buren remained an influential leader within the Democratic Party for the remainder of the decade, and his decision to run as the Free Soil candidate in the 1848 election, despite his long-standing opposition to sectional politics, demonstrated that he remained a political force to be reckoned with. However, during the final decade of his life, Van Buren would see his party and country fall apart over the sectional issues he had tried so hard to avoid. What do you think of Martin Van Buren? Was he a shrewd politician who successfully built a political party which became the natural party of government for 3 decades? Or was he a corrupt political manipulator who was accustomed to setting aside his principles for personal gain? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.